Welcome to the lesson on adjectives and articles. We've talked about articles a little bit already, but we'll talk about them in a bit more depth in this lesson. Now, we're also going to use some grammatical terminology. We're going to use nominative and accusative and dative. And if you don't know what those terms means, you should go back and look at lesson 6, I believe it is, the lesson on pronouns. Because in that lesson on pronouns, we discuss cases such as nominative, accusative, and dative, and you'll want to understand what those things mean in order to understand this lesson on adjectives and articles. So if you're not familiar or don't remember what nominative, accusative, and dative mean, go back and review the lesson on pronouns. Another thing we need to understand is how Dutch words change often when we add a vowel to the end of them. Certain consonants will change into other consonants. In particular, we see the changes here. So if a Dutch word ends in a T, it normally ends in a T, if we add a vowel to the end of that word, it changes to a D. Similarly, if it ends in a P sound, it often changes to a B sound. And if it ends in a B and we add a vowel to the end of it, it often changes to a W. Let's look at some examples. So gut, which means good, in some forms we're going to add an E to it, and that T is going to become a D, so it's going to become goede. Drep, which means a step, when we make it plural, it becomes treppe. Often spelled with a B. Some people will spell it with two P's in the middle, but it's often pronounced like a B. Meanwhile, the word for grape is drop, there with the B, and in the plural, that becomes drove. So the B changed to a W. So we want to know those changes in order to form the various forms of the word correctly, but these can also be a challenge if you're looking up a word you don't know in the dictionary. So let's say for some reason you didn't know that Gude, G-U-D-E, came from goot. Well, if you looked up G-U-D-E in a paper dictionary, you might not find it. So you have to realize, oh, wait a second here. I see there's a vowel there at the end. So that D I see there in Gude, that actually might be a T in the root form, and therefore you can look up G-U-T. Or let's say you came across the word drova, and you couldn't find that in a paper dictionary, you would have to realize, oh, but there's an E at the end of that word. That's a vowel. And if that E weren't there, there's a good chance that that W would actually be a B. And so then you could look up drop in the dictionary and you'd find the word grape. So it's important not just to know these for the sake of forming various forms of the words, but also it helps to find the words in the dictionary. So you have to realize that T and D are related, P and B are related, B and W are related. If you see them, you can realize why this is. This isn't random. If you think about T and D, these are similar. In fact, in English, we do something similar. Like if we pronounce the word, we might say, I bet someone, B-E-T. But if you were to use a different word like B-E-T-T-E-R, in British English, that's better. But in American English, we say better. We often change those T's to a D. Similarly, P and B, you can hear that those are related words. They both use the lips. And similarly, B and V, maybe you can hear the connection between those words. In grammatical terms, we would call one of those things a stop, and we'd call the other one a fricative. But we don't need to go into that level of detail. But you do need to know that these sounds alternate, and that the alternation is usually caused by a vowel. Okay, we're going to use, in the coming examples, we're going to use these keywords, de bouwer, bouwere, which means farmer, die vrouw, vijver, which means wife, and spoeg, bicha, which means book. And we're also going to use the adjective goed, good. Now I've chosen these words, da bouwer and die vrouw and spoeg, because they belong to different grammatical genders. Da bouwer is masculine, die vrouw is a feminine word, and spoeg is a neuter word. So these are standing in for words that are masculine, words that are feminine, and words that are neuter. Now I used words that where the grammatical gender matches or often matches the natural gender. But remember, words in Dutch can be any of these genders. It doesn't need to follow, they don't need to follow natural gender. So for example, the word for cake, da kuchen, is masculine. The word for a girl, es mädel, is neuter. So they don't need to follow natural gender. So the first thing we're going to look at is the so-called weak declension. All you really need to know is that this is the pattern that words follow when they have the definite article. That is when they use da, die, or s, the Pennsylvania Dutch words for the. Right? These are what we call the definite article, the word for the, da, die, and s. Now, this is how the words change. It's on your handout. Make sure you've downloaded and printed out the handout. I think it's easier to study it in the handout. First thing we want to note, though, is that the nominative and accusative is the same, and that the dative is doing its own thing. So nominative, accusative, as far as nouns and adjectives go, are the exact same form, but the dative is different. And this is different from pronouns. In pronouns, the accusative often has its own form. If you reviewed the lesson on pronouns, you'll see that, or maybe you remember it anyway. But in nouns, the nominative and accusative are the same, and the dative is different. Now, if you study Standard German, this is different, right? In Standard German, for example, you're used to masculine accusatives having different forms from the nominative, but that's not the case in Pennsylvania Dutch. Nominative and accusative are the same, dative is different. I also want to remind you that just like with pronouns, a lot of Amish and Mennonite speakers do not use the dative. So they'll basically be using nominative and accusative forms instead of the dative. So this is one of the reasons why I left this lesson later on, is because a lot of speakers don't even use the dative. They just use the nominative and accusative, and we're a bit familiar with those things anyway. Let's look at some patterns here. So in this weak declension, forms of the adjective and the article, when you're using the article, the da, die, or s, you see the adjective in the nominative singular is all just what you'd expect. The adjective is gut, and that's just what you use. Da gut Bauer, the good farmer. Die gut Frau, the good wife. Es gut Buch, the good book. Gut just stays the same in the nominative and accusative singular, just the basic form, gut. Now, everywhere else, you notice the bold, everywhere else, a final E is added to the adjective. So if we looked at the plural, for example, die gute Bücher, gut has changed to gute. We know the T changes to D because of the addition of the vowel. Die gute Bücher. And likewise, if we look at the dative, we'll see that an E has been added to the adjective everywhere. Gute Bauer. De gute Frau, gute Buch, de gute Bücher. So if we think about the adjective, basically we see nominative singular is what you'd expect, gut, just the root form. Everywhere else, that is in the plural, and everywhere in the dative, you just add an E. That's not too hard. Basically, nominative singular, just what you'd expect. Everywhere else, you add an E. That's the adjective. Let's take a look at the definite article forms. Now these are different. We've gotten used, I think, throughout the course, we've gotten used to the articles da and die and s and the plural die. And now when we introduce the dative, we see actually there are some new forms to these. So the masculine and neuter dative singular is the feminine dative is da. It happens to match the masculine nominative. And the plural dative is de. Plural, all genders, it's de. So this means the good farmer in the dative would be gute Bauer. The good wife in the dative would be da gute Frau. The good book in the dative would be goede Buch, and the good books in the dative would be de goede Bücher. So this is a little bit more difficult, right? Adjective easy enough. Add an E everywhere if it's not nominative singular. The article, a little bit more tricky. Goede Bauer, goede Buch, de goede Bücher. You just have to study these things if you want to learn them. A reminder that most Mennonite and Amish speakers don't use datives. So this is really something, you want to know this because a lot of things that have been written in Pennsylvania Dutch are written by people who weren't Mennonite and Amish, and so they'll use these forms all the time. So you'll see these all the time. And perhaps you're learning a dialect of Pennsylvania Dutch, which uses these. So let's say you're learning it from Northern Berks County Dutch, amongst speakers, and for example, and out around New Tripoli, things like this. Speakers will use these forms. They'll use the dative forms, and so you'll want to know those. Now, the other declension we're going to look at is usually called the mixed declension, and I'm not going to explain why it's called mixed. That wouldn't be in Learn the Basics of Pennsylvania Dutch. That would be Advanced Pennsylvania Dutch. But basically, this mixed declension is when you have the indefinite article, that is en, or the negative form of it, right, ken, which would be not one, not a, or not any, is ken. So if you have en or ken, then you have the mixed declension, right? You might have the adjective there as well. You don't need to have an adjective. As long as you have en and ken, you would have a mixed declension. Once again, all the forms are on the handout, so I think that's the best way to study them, but we'll look at some of the highlights here. First thing to notice is that in the dative and the plural, once again, the ending is simply E for the adjective. The adjective ending in the plural and the dative is a. So looking at the plural, ken goede Bücher. And then looking at the datives, masculine dative, goede Bauer, or goede Frau, goede Buch. So this was just like the so-called weak declension that used the definite article, da, ds. Everywhere that wasn't the nominative singular, you just added an E. Happens to be the same thing for the mixed declension. So that's not too bad. If we look at the dative indefinite articles, though, that gets a bit more confusing once again. Remember, now the en isn't there anymore. So if you wanted to say a good farmer in the dative, it would be goede Bauer. That's quite a bit, that's a pretty big difference from en is goede Bauer. A good wife in the dative would be goede Frau, goede Frau. And the neuter matches the masculine, goede Buch, a good book. And we can see in the plural, ken goede Bücher, no difference there from the nominative as it happens. Now, unlike the weak, even in the nominative singular, though, the adjective gets some endings. So let's look at the masculine. The masculine has this ending a. So en goede Bauer, en goede Bauer. That would be a good farmer. A farmer would be een Bauer, but a good farmer isn't going to be een goed Bauer. It's going to be een goede Bauer. It has that ending a, not like da goed Bauer, the good farmer, which would be the weak declension because it's got the da. Here we've got the mixed declension en, and we've got this ending a in the weak declension. En goede Bauer. The feminine, en goede Frau, the E sound, en goede Frau, and the neuter, en goed Buch. That's not so far different. Mind you, in some places this would actually have an ending en gutes Buch, but we're going to go with this one, en goed Buch. So let's look at some examples. Sometimes these things are easier to remember from examples. So let's look at our first one. Der gut Bauer schwätzt mit der gute Frau. That means the good farmer speaks or is speaking with the good wife. Der gut Bauer schwätzt mit der gute Frau. And you can see here I've got the weak declension here. I've got da gut, that is the declension that has the da, or the d or the s, the definite article. I've got da gut bawa, that's the nominative. And then I've got the nominative singular, and then I've got da guda fra, that's the dative singular. In the next sentence, I've reversed the gender. So I've got die gut Frau schwätzt mit dem guda bawa. The good woman speaks with the good farmer. I've got the weak declension, feminine nominative, and then I've got the weak declension masculine dative at the end. So one way to learn things like this, you can study the tables, you can practice them. You can also do things like create sample sentences that kind of freeze the forms. And you're like, oh, what's the dative? What's the weak declension dative? Well, you can, if you might be able to remember the sentence more easily. Da gut Bauer schwätzt mit da guda Frau. If you remember that, you'll remember, oh, da guda Frau, da guda is how you make the feminine dative singular. Let's look at the third sentence. Now we're in the mixed declension. En guda Bauer schwätzt mit der guda Frau. A good farmer speaks with a good woman. En guda Bauer schwätzt mit der guda Frau. And our final sentence, our fourth sentence there, is reversing the genders. I've got the the mixed declension feminine there as the subject, the nominative, and I've got the mixed declension masculine there as the dative. En gudi Frau schwätzt mit me guda Bauer. A good woman speaks or is speaking with a good farmer. En gudi Frau schwätzt mit me guda Bauer. A good woman speaks with a good farmer. So these may be easier ways of remembering some of these key forms. You make up example sentences, and sometimes they stick in your head more than if you're just trying to learn a table of kind of data. En gudi Frau schwätzt mit me guda Bauer. That might remind you that the ending of, anytime you've got a feminine noun, you're going to end that I. En gudi Frau schwätzt mit me guda Bauer. So those are some possible hints that might help you to learn these things. I make sample sentences. I also want to remind you once again that a lot of Amish and Mennonites, plain peoples, a lot of them don't use the dative. So basically they just use the nominative accusative form instead of the dative. In addition to that, they tend to decline the plural a little bit different. Rather than die guda bicha with a little e, they tend to have an I sound there, making the sound e, right? So die gudi bicha, the good books. Die gudi, ken gudi bicha, no good books. E is the ending in the plural for a lot of Amish and Mennonite speakers, whereas in other places you have the little e, the written e, the letter e, pronounced at the end. A lot of the Amish Mennonite will use the sound e with an I in these plurals. Die gudi bicha, ken gudi bicha. The other forms, the singular forms, tend to be the same in the different dialects. Now, one common use of the dative is to form the possession of nouns, the possessive case or the genitive case. Now, in English, this is marked by an apostrophe S or an S apostrophe. S apostrophe is if it's plural, and apostrophe S if it's singular. That's how you show possession. So you show the possessive case or the genitive case of a noun in English, is you add these S apostrophes or apostrophe S's. Now, the way you do that in Dutch is you use the dative form of the word plus sai or ira. Sai, as you'll remember from vocabulary earlier on, means his, and ira means her or their. So ira is the feminine singular or the everything plural, and sai is the masculine singular. Let's see some examples. So, ich habe ein Buch, ich habe ein Buch, sei Buch. I have the boy's book. Ich habe ein Buch, sei Buch. Literally in Dutch, you'd be saying, I have the boy in the dative, his book. But we would translate that to I have the boy's book. Basically, you're saying putting the boy in the dative and boo, the boy in the dative, and then using his to form the word sei, which means his. Ich habe ein Buch, sei Buch. Same thing goes on in the feminine. In using names in Pennsylvania Dutch, very often you use a definite article, even if you're using a person's name. So, de Polly ihre Frack is sto. Polly's dress is here. Polly, these names are treated just like nouns. So Polly's dress is here. I'm using, if it were nominative, it would be die Polly, because she's a girl, die Polly. But because it's dative, I'm using the dative form of the feminine singular definite article, which is da. Da Polly ihre Frack is do. Polly's dress is here. Literally, the Polly in the dative, her dress is here. And here's an example of a plural. Wo sind de kleine Kinder ihre Schuhe? Wo sind de kleine Kinder ihre Schuhe? Where are the small children's shoes? Now, notice in Deutsch, this is clearly the shoes that belong to the small children and not small children's shoes. That's because that word kleine there, which means small, is before Kinder, which means children. Whereas if I were talking about their small shoes, I would put that form of glei small in front of shoe. So the Deutsch is pretty clear that the children are the small things here, not the shoes. Where if you say in English, where are the small children's shoes? It could be the children who are small, it could be the shoes. So this is one way where Deutsch is a bit more precise than English. Wo sind de kleine Kinder ihre Schuhe? So that what I'm really literally saying here is where are the small children in the dative their shoes? Where are the small children in the dative their shoes? And that's how you form and show possession with nouns in Dutch. I.e. the same places where you add apostrophe s or s apostrophe in English, you change the noun to the dative and you throw in the possessive adjective, either sei, his, or ihre, her, or their. Okay, let's look at some adjectives. Gut, we've already been using, that means good, like ich bin gut, I am good. Schlecht means bad. Glei means small. And for our purposes, I've put a superscript n after glei. And you might remember what that means if you think back to the lesson on present tense part 2. Basically, this superscript n is indicates or lets you know that if you add a vowel, the n goes in its place. Hence, we saw that sentence, de kleine Kinder, the small children. I had to add the little e ending to the adjective. So an n got placed in between, kleine. Now, you don't usually write that superscript n. That's just something I put into vocabularies to remind people that in this particular word, if you're going to add a vowel, you got to throw in an n first. So glei is small. If you were to say he is small, you would say as glei. He is small, as glei. Big is gross. Gross. If you say she is big, you say sie ist groß. Gross. If you were to say they are big children, you would say sie sind große Kinder. Schön means beautiful, and that little superscript n tells you that if you're going to add an ending, you need to put an n before the ending, an ending that begins with a vowel. So for example, if we were to think about a beautiful day, if you look at the handout, you'll see that day is masculine, so you know the adjective would have to have the ending a, er. So putting it all together, a beautiful day would be een schöner dag. Een schöner dag. So if you were to say it is a beautiful day, you would say Es is een schöne dag. Or a little bit faster. Es ist een schöne dag. Es ist een schöne dag. It's a beautiful day. Es ist een schöne dag. Important is wichtig. Wichtig. It's important would be es ist wichtig. Es ist wichtig. Es ist wichtig. And sei, we know, means his or its. And ihre means her or their. Until next time, bis nächst Mal. Until next time, mach's gut.